I wasted 29 years figuring this out the slow way, the hard way, the way that costs you relationships, jobs, sleep, and a decent chunk of your 20s. You're about to get all of it in 15 minutes. Not because you're smarter than me, because I already paid the tuition so you don't have to. Here's the deal. There are 10 lessons on this list. I'm giving them to you in the exact order I wish someone had handed them to me, back when I still thought I had all the answers. Not the polished version of wisdom from a graduation speech. The version that comes from getting it wrong first several times in front of people who were watching, and I need you to stay until the very last one. Because Lesson 10 isn't just another item on a list. It's the thing that quietly explains why the other 9 didn't work for me until I understood it. Every one of the first 9 lessons I technically knew years before I actually lived by them. Knowing a lesson and living inside it turned out to be 2 different things, and that gap is where most of my 20s disappeared. If you skip to the end, none of it will make sense. So don't. Let's get into it. Lesson 1. Nobody is coming to save you. This one sounds harsh the first time you hear it, and it should. For most of my 20s, some part of me was waiting for the right boss to finally notice my effort, waiting for a partner to magically read my mind and meet a need I never actually voiced, waiting for some future version of life where things would just click into place without me forcing them to. Psychologists call this an external locus of control, the belief that outcomes in your life are mostly controlled by forces outside of you. Luck, other people, circumstance, and the data on this is almost uncomfortable to look at. People who operate from an external locus of control report lower life satisfaction, more anxiety, and they take longer to recover from setbacks, because in their mind, the setback wasn't something they can fix. It was just something that happened to them. The people who move fastest through pain are the ones who quietly shift the question from why is this happening to me to what am I going to do about it. Not because the world is fair. It isn't. But because that single shift in framing is the difference between being a passenger in your own life and actually gripping the wheel. I didn't learn this until my late 20s, sitting in a job I hated, blaming a manager who was never going to change, waiting for a rescue that was never going to arrive. I used to rehearse the conversation in my head, where someone finally noticed how hard I was working and handed me the opportunity I felt I deserved. That conversation never came, because it was never anyone else's job to hand it to me. The day I stopped waiting was the same day things actually started moving. Not because the external circumstances changed overnight, but because I finally stopped treating my own life like something that happened to me instead of something I was actively building. And that shift set up the next lesson, because once you stop waiting to be saved, you run straight into a much more uncomfortable question. Lesson 2. Comfort is quietly running your life, and you don't even notice it. Here's an experiment psychologists have run in different forms for decades. Give someone a huge win, a raise, a new relationship, a dream apartment, and measure their happiness a few weeks later. It's almost always back to baseline. This is called hedonic adaptation, and it explains why the goal you're chasing right now won't feel like enough once you get it either. But here's the part that actually matters, the part that took me years to notice. Adaptation doesn't just apply to good things. It applies to bad ones too. You can adapt to a mediocre job. You can adapt to a relationship that quietly drains you. You can adapt to a version of your own life that is technically fine and completely uninspired. And your brain will tell you this is just how things are, because familiar always feels safer than uncertain, even when familiar is slowly costing you something. I stayed in situations 2, sometimes 3 years longer than I should have, not because I didn't see the problem, but because the discomfort of leaving felt louder than the quiet cost of staying. The lesson isn't chase constant excitement. The lesson is get suspicious of comfort that isn't actually serving you. Ask yourself if you're staying because it's right or because it's just familiar. That question alone will save you years. And once you start asking it, you'll immediately run into the next problem because it's rarely just about you. It's about the people around you too. Lesson 3. People only change when they decide to, never when you convince them to. I spent an embarrassing number of years trying to logic people into becoming different versions of themselves. Better arguments, clearer explanations. Surely if I just said it the right way, they'd finally see it and change. They didn't. Almost nobody does, not from an argument. In psychology, this connects to something called cognitive dissonance, the discomfort we feel when new information clashes with how we already see ourselves. And here's the key part. When people feel that clash, they don't usually update their self-image. They defend it. They get defensive. They double down. Sometimes they get outright hostile. Not because you're wrong, but because being wrong in that moment feels like a threat to their identity. So the harder you push someone to see the truth about themselves, the tighter they tend to grip the version of themselves that feels safe. I used to think this meant people were just stubborn or in denial. What it actually means is that change has to come from inside a person, on their own timeline, usually after enough evidence piles up that they can't ignore it anymore. Your job was never to be the one who convinces them. Your job is deciding how long you're willing to wait around for a change that might never come. I stayed in that waiting position for a long time, treating every small improvement as proof the big change was finally coming, when really, I was just watching the same pattern repeat with slightly different decoration each time. That's a different question entirely from trying to fix someone, and it's one I avoided for way too long because facing it honestly meant admitting some situations weren't going to resolve the way I wanted them to. Hold on to this one too. It circles back hard once we reach the last lesson, which brings us straight into something even messier. The stuff going on inside your own head. Lesson 4. Your emotions are information, not instructions. For most of my life, I treated feelings like commands. Angry, so I snap. Anxious, so I avoid. Sad, so I shut down. No gap between the feeling and the reaction, just straight from one to the other. Psychologists call the fix emotional granularity, naming exactly what you feel instead of dumping it all into vague bins like bad or fine. Anxious isn't disappointed. Frustrated isn't hurt. And the second you can tell them apart, you get something you didn't have before, a small gap between the feeling and the reaction. Every decent decision I've ever made lived inside that gap. Quick lesson. Small habit, but keep it in your back pocket because it quietly resurfaces again once we hit lesson 10 in a way that ties everything else together. Lesson 5. Most fights were never about the thing being fought about. I used to think conflict was about the surface issue, dishes left in the sink. Someone showing up 15 minutes late, a comment that landed wrong. It took me way too long to realize that the surface issue is almost never the real issue. Underneath almost every recurring argument is an unmet need that nobody's actually naming out loud. Feeling unimportant, feeling unheard, feeling like your time doesn't matter to the other person. The dishes were never really about the dishes. Once I started asking, what does this person actually need right now instead of who's technically right here, conflicts that used to take days to resolve started resolving in minutes. This doesn't mean you stop having boundaries or stop calling out things that genuinely aren't okay. It means you stop wasting energy debating the symptom while the actual wound sits there completely unaddressed. Keep that phrase in mind too, the actual wound, because it shows up again by name once we get to lesson 10. And learning to see the real issue underneath the surface issue requires a skill most of us were never taught, actually paying attention to what isn't being said. Lesson 6. What someone doesn't say usually matters more than what they do say. I used to be a person who needed everything spelled out. If you didn't say it directly, I assumed it wasn't a problem. That assumption cost me more than almost anything else on this list. A pause before someone answers a question, a short reply where there used to be a long one, someone going quiet instead of arguing back. These aren't nothing. They're data. Most people, when something is genuinely wrong, don't announce it. They withdraw first. They test the water before committing to a conversation that might not go well. Learning to notice the withdrawal before it becomes a full shutdown gave me an early warning system I simply didn't have in my 20s. This isn't about becoming paranoid or reading into every silence like it's a crisis. Most silences really are just someone being tired or distracted, and treating every one of them as a hidden signal will burn you out faster than the problem it's trying to solve. It's about taking silence seriously as information when it's paired with other small shifts, a change in tone, a shorter answer than usual, less initiation than before, instead of dismissing all of it because nothing was technically said out loud. And once you start noticing what people don't say, you start noticing something even more uncomfortable. How much of your own personality has been quietly shaped by the people you've spent the most time around? Lesson 7. You slowly become an average of who you spend time with, whether you notice it or not. This one crept up on me quietly. Your standards, your habits, even the way you talk, they get shaped, slowly and without your permission, by the 5 or 6 people closest to you. Social psychologists call it social contagion, and the finding holds up again and again. Attitudes about money, ambition, even how much you complain, spread through close relationships like a mild infection nobody diagnoses. I didn't notice how much a particular friend group had lowered my own expectations of myself until I stepped away for a few months and felt something shift. Not because they were bad people, because their version of normal had quietly become mine. Sometimes the fastest way to change your life isn't more willpower. It's changing the room you sit in most often. Remember that one too. It matters more once we get to the end. And once your environment starts shifting, you run directly into a myth that almost destroyed a few of my best years. Lesson 8. Time does not heal anything on its own. I used to believe this one completely. Give it time. It'll fade. And for a while, it actually looks like it's working. The sharp edge softens. You stop thinking about it every hour, then every day, then only every so often, and you assume that's healing, that the fading is the cure. It isn't. Choir isn't the same as resolved. What actually heals things is what you do during that time, not the time itself, processing what happened, actually feeling it instead of numbing past it, having the conversation you've been avoiding instead of letting it dissolve into silence. Let me tell you exactly how I learned this one, because it's the memory on this list I still think about most. There was a friendship, close enough to call it family, that ended badly over something that, looking back, a single honest conversation could have fixed. Instead, I did what felt easier in the moment. I let distance handle it. No dramatic fight, just less texting, then no texting, then an unspoken agreement that we both stopped being part of each other's lives. I told myself time would sort it out, the way it sorts out a scraped knee or a rough year at work. 4 years went by. New city, new job, new people, and I genuinely believed the old wound had closed on its own. Then one ordinary Tuesday, sitting in traffic with the radio on, a song came on that we used to play on long drives, and without warning, the entire thing came back. Fully intact, sharp in exactly the same places it had been sharp 4 years earlier. Not faded, the same weight, sitting in the same spot in my chest, like no time had passed at all. That's the part nobody warns you about. Unprocessed pain doesn't quietly evaporate in the background the way we assume it will while we're busy living our lives around it. It waits, patient and untouched, for the one unguarded moment when your defenses happen to be down. And then it arrives exactly as intact as the day you buried it. Sometimes years later, sometimes with a song playing in the background of a car you didn't even own back then. The lesson isn't wait it out. The lesson is do the uncomfortable work now. Have the conversation now. Feel the thing now, because later doesn't discount the price. It just adds interest, and it collects that interest whenever it wants, without asking your permission first. Lesson 9. Discipline was never about motivation, and waiting to feel ready was the whole problem. For years, I waited to feel motivated before starting anything meaningful. Waited to feel ready, waited to feel like I was in the right headspace. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Motivation almost never arrives first. Action comes first, and the motivation follows once you're already moving, not before. This connects to how the brain's reward system actually works. Dopamine fires in anticipation of progress, which means the feeling of motivation is often a response to movement you already started, not a prerequisite for starting at all. Waiting to feel ready is like waiting for a car engine to warm up before you turn the key. It doesn't work that way. You turn the key first. I wasted years waiting for a feeling that was only ever going to show up after I'd already begun. And that misunderstanding sets up the very last lesson on this list. The one lesson that quietly touches every single thing we've already covered. The waiting, the convincing, the wound, the room you sit in, all of it. The one that actually explains why every lesson before it kept quietly failing for me until I understood it. This next one is the whole reason I wanted to make this video in the first place. Lesson 10. None of the other 9 lessons work until you stop needing other people to validate your worth. This is the one. Everything else on this list, waiting to be saved, chasing comfort, trying to convince people, reading emotions, reading silence, choosing your environment, doing the work instead of waiting, taking action before motivation, none of it holds if your sense of worth is still sitting in someone else's hands. For most of my life, my mood on any given day was basically decided by other people. A text that didn't get answered fast enough, a comment that felt slightly off, someone's approval or the lack of it. I was outsourcing something that was never supposed to be outsourced in the first place. Psychologists call the healthier alternative to this an internal locus of self-worth, a sense of value that isn't constantly renegotiated based on how someone else is behaving that day. And it doesn't mean you stop caring what people think. It means their opinion stops being the deciding vote on whether you're allowed to feel okay about yourself. Once that shift happens, everything else on this list becomes so much easier. You stop waiting to be rescued because you already know you're the one steering. You stop chasing shallow comfort because you're not trying to fill a hole that was never about comfort in the first place. You stop needing to convince people because their opinion isn't the foundation you're standing on anymore. This is the lesson that took me the longest, partly because it doesn't announce itself the way the others do. There's no single moment where someone tells you your self-worth is misplaced. It shows up quietly in how much a stranger's opinion can ruin an otherwise good afternoon, in how much you rehearse a message before sending it, and how relieved you feel when someone simply approves of a decision you'd already made anyway. Once I noticed how much power I'd handed out without ever being asked to, taking it back felt less like a single decision and more like a slow, deliberate habit, practiced one interaction at a time. And honestly, it's the only lesson on this list that actually made the other 9 stick. So there it is. 10 lessons, 29 years condensed into 15 minutes, and if even one of these hit a little too close to home, that's not a coincidence. It means some part of you already recognized it before I said it out loud, and that recognition is usually the first real step toward actually changing it. Tell me in the comments which lesson you're still in the middle of learning right now, because I guarantee you're not the only one sitting with that exact one, and there's a decent chance someone in these comments is exactly where you were a few years ago and needs to hear that it does eventually shift. And if this saved you even a fraction of the time it cost me, do the one thing that actually helps. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today instead of 5 years from now. I'll see you in the next one.